On one side stood a large, well-equipped army. On the other stood a small band of believers, men who were about to face more than a battle. They were about to face a question of survival itself. In the heart of the desert, at a place called Badr, only a few years after the migration that would change the course of history, two forces were on a course collision. What happened next would echo through Islamic history for 14 centuries and counting. This was the year 2 after Hijrah, 2 years after the Prophet Muhammad and his followers had fled persecution in Mecca and built a new community in the city of Medina. By this point, that community was growing, but peace with the Quraysh, the powerful tribe that ruled Mecca and had driven the Muslims out, was nowhere in sight. Then came a trigger, a Meccan trade caravan. What began as an attempt to intercept it spiraled into something far bigger. The Muslims had not set out that week expecting a full-scale war, but the events on the ground would leave them no way to turn back. Badr itself was a modest place, a cluster of wells along a major trade route southwest of Medina. Nothing about it looked like the setting for a turning point in history. And yet, that is exactly what it was about to become. As the Muslims moved south, two separate threats loomed ahead of them, a caravan and an army. The caravan, led by a Meccan merchant named Abu Sufyan, sensed danger. Abu Sufyan changed course, hugging the coastline to avoid the Muslim forces and slip safely back toward Mecca. But Mecca had already reacted. A large fighting force, led by a fierce opponent of the Prophet named Abu Jahl, had already marched out of the city. Their goal was no longer simply to protect the caravan. By the time news reached them that the caravan was safe, pride and old hostility had taken over. A clash between the two sides was now almost impossible to avoid. The Prophet Muhammad turned to his companions and asked for their counsel. Both groups within his growing community, the Muhajirun, the migrants who had left everything behind in Mecca, and the Ansar, the local Medinans who had welcomed them, pledged their full support. Here lies one of the most important lessons of Badr. This journey had started as a mission to intercept a caravan. It ended with the small Muslim community stepping into a war they had never planned to fight. The Quran itself recalls this exact moment, describing how the believers had hoped to secure one of the two prizes ahead of them, the caravan or the fight, while God had already determined something greater, an outcome that would establish truth and dismantle falsehood. As the Muslims reached Badr, they set up camp near the wells. Their numbers were small, around 313 men. Their weapons and supplies were limited. The Quraysh army, by contrast, numbered close to 1,000. The gap was obvious, but the story of Badr cannot be measured by numbers alone. Facing this imbalance, the Prophet turned to God in prayer, not a quiet, private request, but an urgent, deeply felt plea for help. The Quran itself recalls this exact moment, the Prophet calling out to his Lord for aid. God's answer came in the form of a promise that he would send angels to support the believers. This did not mean the human effort stopped mattering, quite the opposite. Badr shows how prayer, preparation, patience, and complete trust in God worked together side by side, not as substitutes for one another. Ahead of them lay battle. Behind them lay Medina. And in their hearts was nothing but reliance on God. The night before the fighting began was, according to the Quran, marked by a moment of divine mercy. God sent a calm over the believers and sent rain that strengthened them and purified the ground beneath their feet. Then came the dawn. The Muslims prepared for battle. The Prophet personally arranged their ranks, positioning his men with care. Two armies now stood face to face on the plain of Badr. But before the fighting erupted, something else happened first. a handful of Quraysh warriors stepped forward, calling for one-on-one combat, a traditional prelude to battle in Arabian warfare. Several companions of the Prophet answered the challenge and stepped out to meet them. Then, the wider battle began. In these opening moments, it quickly became clear that this was not going to be an ordinary fight. Every decision, every position taken, every single moment carried weight far beyond the battlefield itself. Later, the Quran would recall this victory directly, reminding the believers that God had helped them at a time when they were weak and vulnerable. After the initial duels, the main clash erupted. The battlefield at Badr turned fierce. The Muslims faced a Quraysh force that outnumbered them and outmatched them in equipment, but the outcome would not be decided by size alone. In one of the most striking verses connected to this battle, the Quran tells the believers, it was not they who killed the enemy that day, it was God who brought about their defeat. And when the Prophet threw a handful of sand toward the enemy lines, it was not merely a human act, it was carried by God's own will. This verse ties the outcome of the battle directly to divine intervention. Throughout the fighting, the Prophet encouraged his companions, urging them forward. Authentic hadith accounts preserve detailed memories of these moments. Fear, exhaustion, danger, all tested at once. But one truth stood out above all else that day. Victory does not belong to whoever has the bigger army. Divine aid and the obedience of the believers, these two threads run through the entire story of Badr. The Quran speaks plainly about angelic support during the battle. God says he aided the believers through the angels. But this help should never be imagined as some kind of legend or fantasy. The Quran frames it as a good news from God, a source of reassurance meant to calm the hearts of the believers, not a spectacle. Just as significant was the Prophet's prayer before the battle even began, when he turned to God and asked directly for help. For the Muslims, the greatest test that day was this: staying steady despite being outnumbered. The Quran instructs believers that when they face an opposing force, they should stand firm and remember God constantly. Badr, then, is not simply a story of military strategy. It is a story of self-restraint. It is a story of faith. And it is the moment when human beings acknowledged their own limits and placed their trust in God instead. As the tide of battle turned in favor of the Muslims, the Quraysh ranks began to collapse. Several of their most powerful leaders were killed in the fighting. Among them was Abu Jahl, one of the fiercest and most prominent opponents the Prophet had faced in Mecca. Authentic hadith accounts describe in detail the circumstances surrounding his death after the battle. Once the outcome of the fighting became clear, the Prophet gave his companions instructions regarding the bodies of the fallen Quraysh leaders. What followed reveals a deeper truth. Victory in battle was never only about defeating an enemy. It marked the beginning of an entirely new reality. The Muslim community in Medina was no longer as vulnerable to Meccan pressure as it had been before. The victory at Badr strengthened their political and social standing across Arabia. But this victory came with no room for arrogance, only gratitude toward God, because in the language of the Quran, the triumph had come from God alone. In the aftermath, the Muslims faced a new decision: what to do with the prisoners of war. The Prophet once again consulted his companions. This moment shows just how much deliberation mattered even after the fighting had ended. Opinions were shared on how the captives should be treated. In the end, a decision was reached, and many prisoners were released after a ransom was arranged. This, too, reveals something essential about Islamic history. Badr was never only a name for victory on a battlefield, it was also a chapter of moral and social decision-making in the aftermath of war. Victory brought new responsibility. How a person or a community behaves after gaining power is itself part of the historical record. After Badr, the Muslim community understood that a larger future lay ahead of them. And the Quraysh understood something too. The small Muslim community in Medina could no longer be dismissed or ignored. Badr, then, was not the end of a conflict. It was the opening chapter of a much longer struggle in Arabian history. So what is the greatest lesson of Badr? It is not simply that a small army defeated a much larger one. The Quran never presents Badr as a story about numbers. God says He helped the believers precisely when they were weak. And that weakness was real. Their numbers were small, their supplies were limited, their experience in war was uneven compared to their opponent, but their faith was firm, and their leadership rested in the hands of the Prophet Muhammad. Badr reminds us that human calculations and divine help do not always follow the same arithmetic. But this never meant that human effort was unnecessary. In fact, Badr shows preparation, consultation, strategic positioning, prayer, patience, and obedience, all working together at once. This is why Badr is remembered as more than a military victory. It stands as a chapter in the testing of faith itself. And the memory of that test has been preserved directly within the Quran. There is another remarkable detail about Badr. Its memory never faded into simple history. The Quran refers to the day of Badr as Yawm al-Furqan, the day of distinction, the day the line between truth and falsehood was made unmistakably clear. That name alone reveals how significant the battle was, because the outcome at Badr was never just about one army defeating another. It shaped the future of the entire Muslim community in Medina. A community that, only a short time earlier, had fled Mecca to rebuild its life from nothing, was now emerging as a real political force in Arabia. But in the Islamic understanding, the true source of strength was never numbers. The Quran repeats again and again that help comes from God alone. So the memory of Badr was never meant to breed pride. It is a memory of gratitude. It is a memory of responsibility and a reminder that walking the path of truth does not mean a life free of hardship. Sometimes, the path of truth passes directly through the hardest trials a person will ever face. Standing on the plain of Badr today, a visitor might never guess that this quiet stretch of desert once bore witness to one of the most defining chapters in Islamic history. But history does not live in stone and sand alone. History lives in the decisions people make. On the day of Badr, the believers learned that it is possible to stand firm even in the presence of fear. They learned that being outnumbered does not mean abandoning the truth. And most of all, they learned that when victory comes, it should never be claimed as one's own achievement. It should be recognized as a gift from God. The Quran recalls the events of Badr so that people across every generation might draw lessons from it. For people today, the lessons of Badr are not simply a war story. It is a lesson in patience during crisis. It is a lesson in preparation. It is a lesson in consultation. It is a lesson in placing complete trust in God, what Islamic tradition calls tawakkul. And it leaves us with this reminder: trials will always come to those who walk the path of truth. But sometimes, in the very depth of that trial, a kind of help arrives that no human strength could have secured alone. Badr does not simply tell us about a battle from the past. It calls us, even now, to hold on to patience in times of crisis, to prepare with sincerity, and to place our trust firmly in God. And perhaps, even today, the silence of that desert leaves us with one lasting question. When our own trials come, will we be able to stand firm on the side of truth? Badr has become history, but its lesson is still very much alive.